In the rotting heart of a Louisiana plantation, a grandfather clock has stood frozen for 70 years, its hands locked, its secret sealed by a dying woman's final prayer. No one dared touch it. Until one man did. What he found wasn't time, it was the exact moment sin demanded payment. The air inside Belle Rêve hung like a burial shroud, thick, sweet with the rot of jasmine long dead, and heavy with the breath of 70 years no living soul had disturbed. Dust motes drifted in shafts of dying sunlight that sliced through grimy panes, painting pale gold stripes across wide cypress planks worn smooth by generations of footsteps that had never quite escaped. In the center of the grand hall, the clock rose like a dark judge, 7 feet of mahogany carved with twisting roses and thorns that looked almost alive, almost bleeding. Its brass face, tarnished, unmarked, stared back with Roman numerals that no longer told hours, only accusations. The pendulum hung motionless. The hands were frozen at 3:17, a quarter past 3 on a day no one alive remembered. Yet the silence around it was louder than any chime. It felt watchful. As if the clock itself had been waiting for the right soul to arrive and pay the price. This is the story of Belle Rêve, French for beautiful dream, and how every dream born in blood eventually wakes up screaming. The year was 1935. America was still bleeding from the Great Depression, and Arthur Finch, 28 years old, stepped off a dusty road into a world that had already died. He had inherited the plantation from a great-aunt he had never met, Clara Thorne, a woman whose name his grandmother only ever spoke in the same tone one uses for a grave. Arthur was no romantic. He was a practical man who had spent the last 6 years watching men sell their souls for a loaf of bread in New Orleans alleyways. He came to Belle Rêve expecting rot, decay, and maybe enough salvageable timber to keep him from starving. What he found instead was a presence. The mansion crouched at the edge of the bayou like something wounded but still breathing. Once white columns now peeled in long gray strips, revealing black cypress beneath, scarred by 100 Louisiana summers. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like funeral veils, swaying even when there was no wind, brushing the sagging verandas with wet, whispering fingers. Inside, the smell was everywhere, damp earth, decaying leaves, and something sweeter, almost sickening, like flowers left too long on a coffin. The heat pressed down, thick as molasses, making every breath feel like swallowing warm water. Yet the clock dominated everything. It stood in the main hall beneath a cracked plaster medallion where a crystal chandelier, half its prisms missing, hung like a broken crown. The wallpaper, once rich damask, had faded to the color of old bone and curled away in strips that looked like parchment from a forgotten testament. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets waited beneath like shrouded bodies laid out for judgment. But the clock felt alive in a way the rest of the house did not. Its wood was still warm to the touch, as if it had been holding heat for decades. Arthur ran his calloused fingers across the carvings, shepherds and lambs, blooming roses, twisting vines, scenes of paradise that now felt like mockery in a house built on the backs of the enslaved. He tried to wind it. The keyhole was there, but the mechanism inside had seized solid. The hands refused to move. A thin seam ran down the right side of the case, so precise it was almost invisible, suggesting a hidden compartment. He pressed, twisted, pried with a thin knife until he feared he would crack the antique wood. Nothing. The clock simply resisted. As if it had been sealed by something stronger than nails or glue. 70 years, his grandmother Era had told him the day he left New Orleans. Her voice had been thin as river mist. 70 years since the war ended, almost to the day. That clock ain't told time since old Miss Clara sealed it herself. And nobody touched it after. Era lived in a small weathered cabin a mile down the road, the same cabin that had once housed the enslaved who worked these fields. She was a small woman of unbreakable quiet strength, her skin like dark, weathered leather, her eyes still sharp enough to cut through lies. She had never lived inside Belle Rêve. She had only lived in its shadow. When Arthur asked her what the clock held, she paused over her mending, needle hovering like a warning. "Some things, child," she said, voice low against the crackle of her hearth fire, "are best left sealed. Some truths ain't meant for the light of day. Not after so long." But Arthur was a man who had lost everything in the Depression. He did not believe in leaving things sealed. Days blurred into humid weeks. He explored the house like a man walking through a dream that refused to end. The library smelled of mildew and forgotten leather. Books crumbled when he opened them. The long dining table bore scars from knives and perhaps worse. Upstairs, four-poster beds stood like silent witnesses under dusty sheets. Yet every evening he returned to the hall and sat on the floor before the clock, staring at its frozen face as the bayou sang its night chorus of frogs, cicadas, the distant splash of something large moving through black water. He began to feel watched. Not by ghosts in white, the old Hollywood kind, but by something heavier. Something biblical. The clock was no longer furniture. It had become a monument to stop time, like the sun Joshua commanded to stand still so justice could be finished. Or like the pause between the last plague and the first cry of the Passover lamb. A moment held in suspension until the right sinner arrived to open it. One sweltering afternoon, sweat stinging his eyes, Arthur noticed something he had missed before, a tiny, deliberate scratch near the base of the clock. An almost invisible letter L carved into the mahogany, so small it looked like a single thorn from the floral pattern. He ran his thumb over it and felt the past brush against his skin like cold breath. L. Who was L? He returned to Era's cabin that evening. She was shelling peas on her porch, the air thick with honeysuckle and damp earth. Arthur sat on the steps and asked again, voice tight with the obsession that had begun to grow inside him like Spanish moss. Grandma, that letter L on the clock. You said Clara sealed it after the war. Did she ever speak a name? Did she ever say why? Era's hands slowed. Her gaze drifted across the fields toward the shimmering heat haze rising from Belle Rêve like a soul leaving a body. Clara Thorne was a woman on fire, she said quietly. Even when she tried to hide it. After the war, after everything that happened here, something broke open inside her. She locked herself in that hall for 3 days and 3 nights. Wouldn't let a soul near her. When she finally came out, her eyes were swollen red, but her jaw was set like iron. She told the house servants the clock was never to be opened again. Not while any of us still drew breath. Said it was to keep time from moving forward. To hold one moment that should never be forgotten, and could never be spoken aloud. Era looked at Arthur then, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. She said some sins don't die with the sinner. They just wait for the right bloodline to come home and pay the interest. Arthur felt the words settle in his chest like river stones. That night he returned to the hall with a magnifying glass he had found in the dusty library. Under its lens the letter L stood out sharp and deliberate. And just beneath the ornate pediment at the very top of the clock, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a tiny pinhole, perfectly round, perfectly placed. The kind of hole a man with a passion for intricate mechanisms might drill for a hidden latch. Arthur remembered stories his grandmother had told him about Elias Thorne, Clara's father, a man obsessed with clocks and puzzles and secrets. Elias had kept a set of needle-thin tools, the kind watchmakers and locksmiths used for the most delicate work. Tools that could open doors no one else could see. The bayou wind moved through the broken windows, carrying the scent of stagnant water and distant decay. Somewhere deep in the house a timber creaked, as if the plantation itself were shifting, stretching, waking up. Arthur Finch stood before the silent clock, heart pounding against his ribs like a second pendulum that had just begun to swing. He did not yet know it, but he was no longer simply restoring an old house. He was about to open the door to 70 years of divine silence and whatever justice had been waiting on the other side. The hidden panel gave way with a soft, almost reluctant sigh, like a tomb finally exhaling after decades of holding its breath. A rush of ancient air washed over Arthur Finch, musty, heavy with the scent of dried paper, faded velvet, and something far more haunting, the faint, melancholic perfume of a dark red rose pressed so long ago its petals had become brittle as butterfly wings. His fingers trembled as they reached inside the velvet-lined compartment. 3 objects rested there like sacred relics or evidence at a divine trial. A leather-bound journal, its cover cool and smooth, pages yellowed with time. A small oval silver locket, tarnished but still bearing delicate floral engravings. And one single pressed rose, dark as dried blood. Arthur lifted the journal first. The leather felt alive beneath his touch. He carried it to the dimly lit library, the only room in Belle Rêve that still offered a worn leather armchair amid the decay. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light filtering through grimy windows. Outside, the bayou hummed with cicadas and the low croak of frogs, but inside, the only sound was the brittle crackle of pages as he opened the book. The first entry was written in elegant, looping script. Clara Thorne, Belle Rêve, 1858. A voice from 70 years ago reached across time and spoke directly into Arthur's soul. The early pages painted a portrait of privilege wrapped in Southern gentility. Young Clara wrote of piano lessons beneath magnolia trees, social calls, poetry books brought from New Orleans, and endless summer days thick with the drone of insects and the heavy sweetness of blooming flowers. She described her father, Elias Thorne, with a mixture of awe and quiet fear, a towering patriarch who ruled Belle Rêve with iron will and colder calculation. Her mother had died young, mentioned only in passing, like a ghost too faint to linger. But beneath the surface elegance, unease began to bleed through the ink. Clara's words grew sharper as she observed the people who actually kept the plantation alive, the enslaved men and women whose labor built her world. She no longer wrote of them as property. She wrote of them as souls. Especially one young woman named Lena. Lena was Clara's own age. She worked in the main house with a quiet grace that seemed to defy everything around her. Clara described her intelligence, her dignity, the way her eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years. There was admiration there, and something deeper. Kinship. October 5, 1859. Lena was ill today. Papa sent for the doctor, a thing he rarely does for any in the quarters. But Lena, she carries herself with a strength that even Papa seems to notice, though he would never admit it. Her eyes hold secrets. I find myself drawn to her presence, even though an unbridgeable chasm lies between us. Arthur paused, his breath caught. He set the journal down and picked up the silver locket. Its surface was cool, engraved with tiny flowers that looked almost like thorns when the light hit them just right. With careful fingers he pried it open. Inside, on one side, rested a tiny faded daguerreotype of a young black woman. Her features were refined, her skin a warm deep brown, her eyes intelligent and serene, yet carrying an unmistakable sorrow. On the opposite side, preserved beneath a thin sheet of glass, lay a lock of dark, tightly coiled hair. This was Lena. The L carved into the base of the clock. The pressed rose. Everything pointed back to her. He returned to the journal, heart growing heavier with every turning page. The entries darkened as 1860 unfolded. Clara began to notice the way Lena avoided her father's gaze. The way her shoulders hunched when Elias entered a room. The unnatural tension that filled the house like smoke before a fire. March 20, 1860. Papa has been spending more time in the quarters. He claims it is only to oversee the new planting, but I see the truth in Lena's eyes. She carries herself differently now, guarded, wounded. There is a silence in this house that screams louder than any cry. I feel a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, a premonition of something terrible approaching. Then came the entries that made Arthur's blood run cold. Lena was with child. Clara's handwriting grew frantic, the elegant loops tightening into desperate strokes. She wrote of her father's cold denial, his refusal to even acknowledge the growing evidence. The child, Clara realized with horror, belonged to Elias Thorne himself. July 1, 1860. It is true. Lena is with child, and Papa denies it with a vehemence that chills me to the bone. He calls it a lie, a fabrication meant to shame him. But I see the truth in Lena's eyes, in the way she moves, in the way Papa now avoids looking at her entirely. My heart aches for her. What will become of her? Of this innocent life? Elias's response was merciless. He made arrangements to sell the child the moment it was born to remove the stain from his reputation and from Belle Rêve. Clara pleaded, wept, argued. She begged her father to show mercy, to let her raise the child herself, to spare Lena this final cruelty. Elias looked at his daughter with eyes colder than winter ice and spoke words that would haunt the family for generations. It is a necessary evil. For the good of the plantation. For the good of our name. Necessary evil. Arthur felt those two words sink into him like a blade. The casual way Clara had recorded them, elegant ink on fine paper, made the horror even more grotesque. He stared at the pressed rose, its dark petals fragile and broken, a symbol of beauty crushed before it could ever fully bloom. The weight of generational sin pressed down on him in that dusty library. He understood now why Era had warned him so gravely. Some truths were never meant to see daylight. Some sins were so heavy they required divine silence for 70 years just to contain them. But the journal was not finished. The entries grew more agitated as 1861 dawned, the same year the nation itself began to tear apart with the coming of civil war. On January 22, 1861, Clara wrote with trembling hand. "The child was born last night. A boy. He is beautiful, he has Lena's eyes, but Papa's mouth. Lena held him for only a few hours. Her cries still echo through the halls and haunt my every waking moment. I tried to intervene. I offered to raise him myself, to keep him here at Belle Rêve. Papa merely laughed, a cold, hollow sound that contained no joy. He said it was already done. The buyer, a planter named Davies from Mississippi, took the child before dawn." Clara's final lines in that entry dripped with self-loathing. "Lena is a ghost now. Her spirit, once so bright, has been extinguished. And I am a coward. I did nothing." Arthur closed his eyes, picturing the scene in vivid, merciless detail, the newborn's first cries cut short, the young mother's arms emptied by force, the cold indifference of Elias Thorne as he removed his own flesh and blood like a problem to be sold downriver. The locket felt heavier than lead in his palm. The pressed rose seemed to carry the scent of blood rather than flowers. He could no longer sit still. That same evening, storm clouds gathering over the bayou, Arthur walked the mile to Era's cabin, the journal clutched tightly against his chest. Rain began to fall in fat, warm drops as he climbed the porch steps. Era sat in her rocking chair, staring out across the fields toward Belle Rêve. Her face looked like a road map of sorrows older than she was. "Grandma," Arthur's voice came out hoarse, cracked by emotion. "I read about Lena, about the child. Elias sold his own son. His own blood." Era turned slowly. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, still held a piercing intensity that cut straight through him. "So the clock finally gave up its ghost," she said quietly. "Clara always knew it would, one day. Come sit, child. There's more to that story than even Clara could bring herself to write down." Arthur sat. The journal lay open on his lap to the page describing the child's sale. Rain drummed softly on the tin roof above them. Era continued, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of 70 unbroken years of silence. "Elias Thorne valued only one thing above all else: his name, his reputation, his power. A child born of a slave woman who carried his own features? That was a stain he could not abide. He saw the boy as weakness, as proof of his own failure to control everything." Era paused, letting thunder roll in the distance before she delivered the final blow. "But Lena, she was more than just his property. She was his daughter too. His own flesh and blood. My mother, Adeline, was brought here from Virginia when she was barely more than a girl. Elias took her. Lena was born soon after. Clara knew it deep down. That's why the bond between them felt so strong, and why the betrayal cut so deep." Arthur stared at his grandmother, the horror deepening into something almost biblical. Incest. Betrayal. The selling of his own grandson. The air between them felt charged, as if the storm itself was listening. "And the child?" Arthur whispered. "Lena's son, what happened to him?" Era's voice dropped to a broken whisper, the kind of pain that 70 years had not dulled, only sharpened. "He was sold south. To a sugar plantation deep in the Mississippi Delta. We never heard of him again." Lightning flashed across the bayou, illuminating Era's face for a brief, terrible moment. In that split second, Arthur saw not just an old woman, but the living witness to generational sin that had been locked inside a clock for 70 years, waiting for the right descendant to open it and finally face divine judgment. The rain fell harder now, washing over Belle Rêve in the distance like tears that had been held back for far too long. Arthur Finch understood in that moment that he had not simply inherited a decaying plantation. He had inherited a reckoning. The storm broke over the bayou like divine judgment unleashed. Rain hammered the tin roof of Era's cabin in relentless sheets, turning the red earth into dark, glistening mud that seemed to bleed from the wounds of Belle Rêve itself. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss like mourners at an open grave. Inside the small cabin, the air grew thick with the scent of wet wood, damp earth, and the heavy weight of truths too long buried. Arthur Finch sat frozen, the leather journal heavy in his lap, while his grandmother's voice, low, rhythmic, ancient, cut through the roar of the rain like a blade through silence. "Lena, she never recovered," Era said softly, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the rain-streaked window. "After they took her boy, the light in her eyes died. She moved through Belle Rêve like a shadow, present in body, but her soul had already crossed over. She stayed on the land, but she wasn't truly there anymore. She just existed." Arthur's throat tightened. He thought of Clara's frantic entries, her desperate pleas that had fallen on deaf ears. And Clara? She tried to make it right? Era gave a faint, bitter smile that held no joy. In her own way, yes. She would sit with Lena for hours. Read poetry to her. Bring flowers from the garden. Anything to spark a flicker of life back into those empty eyes. But some wounds go too deep for words or kindness to reach. The war came, everything changed for the South, and yet for Lena, nothing truly changed. Freedom came too late. She paused, letting the thunder roll before continuing, her voice carrying the cadence of old spirituals. "I remember her, Arthur. Lena had a spirit once, a quiet fire. She loved to sing. Soft, low spirituals that would rise from the quarters at dusk and make your chest ache with longing. Songs about crossing Jordan, about deliverance, about a better home waiting somewhere beyond the river. After the boy was taken, she stopped singing. The music died with her hope. She faded year by year until one quiet morning a few years after the war, she simply slipped away like a candle flame guttering out in the wind. They buried her in the old slave cemetery beneath a weeping willow. No headstone. Just a simple mound of earth that the grass eventually claimed." Arthur leaned forward, a sudden, dawning realization hitting him like cold water. "Grandma, how do you know all this? You speak of Lena as if you knew her heart. As if you walked beside her every day." A profound silence fell between them, broken only by the drumming rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Era turned her ancient, knowing eyes to meet his. In that moment, the weight of generations pressed down upon the small porch. "Because I was there, Arthur," she said simply. "I was born on this land, just like Lena. I was there the night they took her child. I was there when she died. And I was there the day Clara sealed that clock forever." Arthur felt the words strike him like a physical blow. His heart stuttered. "You were there? But, how old were you?" Era offered a faint, sad smile that carried the sorrow of decades. "Old enough to remember. Old enough to understand. Old enough to carry the weight of it all these years without ever speaking it aloud." She glanced at the journal in his hands, her gnarled fingers tracing the edge of the leather as if touching a sacred relic. Clara tried to do right in the end. She couldn't change the past, but she could preserve the truth. That clock became her silent monument, a place where Lena's story would wait until someone strong enough could bear to hear it. A truth buried, but never destroyed. The rain lashed harder, mirroring the storm breaking open inside Arthur's soul. The past was no longer ink on brittle pages. It was alive, embodied in the quiet, unbreakable strength of the woman who had raised him. The L carved into the clock. The locket with Lena's face. The pressed rose. They were not mere symbols. They were the legacy of pain, resilience, and silent defiance passed down through blood he now realized ran in his own veins. As the deluge continued, Era spoke on, her voice a low murmur against the storm. Clara was a good woman at heart, but she was still a thorn. She saw the injustice, yes. She felt the guilt like a knife in her chest. But she was trapped by her name, by her station, by the very walls of that grand house built on stolen lives. After the war, when the world turned upside down and the enslaved people began to leave Belle Rêve seeking new beginnings, Lena stayed. Her spirit was too broken to chase freedom. She wandered the decaying fields and empty halls like a ghost still searching for her lost boy. Era's eyes grew distant, lost in memories older than Arthur could imagine. Clara watched her fade day by day. And in those quiet moments, I believe she finally understood the true cost of her father's cruelty, not just the loss of a child, but the complete destruction of a human soul. That's when she decided on her act of defiance. She spent weeks preparing. She transcribed everything, not only her own journal entries, but the fragments Lena had whispered to her in moments of deepest despair. She wrote of Elias's true nature, of the child born of violence and blood, of the locket and the rose as the only witnesses left. She knew future generations of thorns would try to bury it, to twist it, to forget. So she hid the truth instead of destroying it, sealing it away so that one day, when the time was right, someone would find it and finally let Lena's story breathe again. Arthur stared at the journal, then back at his grandmother. She sealed it for exactly 70 years. Why that number? Era's smile was faint and knowing, heavy with the wisdom of survival. 70 years is a lifetime, Arthur. Long enough for the dust of old lies to settle. Long enough for the generation that committed the sin to pass away. Long enough for a new generation, perhaps one ready to face the truth without being crushed by it, to come along and bear its weight. Clara was a visionary in her quiet way. She understood that some truths need time to ripen, to become undeniable before God and man. The rain began to soften into a steady drizzle. A weak sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the deep lines etched around Era's eyes, lines carved by grief, resilience, and unbreakable love. Arthur's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Grandma, you said you were there. You knew Lena. You were born on this land. Who exactly are you to her?" Era met his gaze without flinching. The air between them felt charged, sacred. "Lena was my mother, Arthur." The words landed like thunder. "The child Elias Thorne sold that night, that was my older brother. I was born 2 years later, after the war had already begun. Elias never acknowledged me either. He simply tolerated my presence like an unwelcome shadow in his house. My mother, Lena, she was already broken by then. She couldn't protect me the way she wanted to. But Clara did what she could. She made sure I was cared for. She taught me to read in secret. She made sure I knew my mother's story, even if we could never speak it aloud in the light of day." Arthur felt the world tilt. A dizzying wave of connection washed over him. His own grandmother, the quiet, resilient woman who had shaped his life with her strength and silence, was the daughter of Lena. The granddaughter of Elias Thorne through an act of profound violation. He was directly descended from this unspeakable tragedy. The journal, the locket, the pressed rose, they were tangible links to his own bloodline, stained by cruelty and haunted by justice deferred. The weight settled on his shoulders like the humid Louisiana air itself, heavy, inescapable, and strangely holy. "Clara couldn't save my brother," Era continued softly. "She couldn't pull my mother back from the sorrow that eventually claimed her. But she could ensure their story would not die with them. She sealed that clock with more than paper and wood. She sealed it with a promise that one day the truth would emerge and demand its reckoning." A deep, resonant silence followed, filled with the echoes of generations long gone. Arthur looked at Era not as the grandmother he had always known, but as a living testament, a bridge between suffering and survival, between buried sin and redemptive truth. In the weeks that followed, Arthur moved through Belle Rêve in a feverish state. He pored over Clara's journal late into the humid nights, cross-referencing dates, mapping the fragments of Lena's life. He dug through crumbling ledgers in the library, meticulous records kept by Elias Thorne himself. Among cotton yields, supply purchases, and lists of enslaved people treated as inventory, he found one entry that chilled him to the bone. January 23, 1861, one male infant to Davies, Mississippi. $300. Cold. Impersonal. A human life reduced to a line in a ledger. The casual brutality of it made Arthur's stomach turn. He questioned Era gently but deeply in the evenings. She spoke of Lena's quiet despair, her refusal to leave Belle Rêve even after emancipation, as if she were rooted to the very soil that had witnessed her greatest loss. She said she couldn't go, Era recounted, voice raspy with age and memory. Not until she knew what became of her boy. She always hoped. Even when hope had long since died, she would sit by the road at dusk, watching the horizon, waiting for a face she had barely known to somehow return. The image haunted Arthur, Lena, as a spectral figure. Haunting the landscape of her own sorrow, forever scanning empty roads for a child stolen before he could even speak her name. He tried to trace the Davies family in Mississippi, writing letters to county clerks and historical societies. But the records were sparse, fragmented by war and the indifferent passage of 70 cold years. The trail vanished into the vast, indifferent expanse of Southern history. Even the local community sensed the shift in Arthur. When he visited the nearby general store, the old men who usually whittled wood and swapped stories on the porch grew quiet. Their eyes turned guarded, almost weary. Whispers followed him, fragments of old gossip about the Thorns and things best left buried. The name Elias Thorne still carried a chill decades after his death. One sweltering afternoon, while clearing overgrown gardens behind the mansion, Arthur stumbled upon something half-swallowed by kudzu vines. A small, crude stone marker, almost completely buried in the red earth. He knelt, pulling away the choking green tendrils and dirt with trembling hands. Beneath the vines lay a single hand-carved word. Lena. Below it, a smaller, almost illegible inscription worn by time and weather. My heart, my hope. Arthur knelt there in the mud as the humid air pressed around him, the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves thick in his lungs. Tears he didn't expect burned his eyes. In that moment, the clock in the grand hall no longer felt like an antique. It stood as a monument, a silent, powerful witness to the unspeakable history of Belle Rêve. And to the quiet defiance of the women who refused to let the truth be erased, Clara, who sealed it with trembling hands and tear-stained eyes, Lena, whose spirit was broken but whose story refused to die, and Era, who had carried the burden of memory across 70 years so that one day her grandson could finally open the door to justice long deferred. The plantation wind moved through the live oaks, carrying the faint, haunting echo of a spiritual that had not been sung in decades. Somewhere in the distance, the clock, now open, seemed to wait. Not for time to resume, but for redemption to begin. The small, hand-carved stone marker lay half-buried beneath choking kudzu, its rough letters barely visible after decades of rain and neglect. Arthur knelt in the damp earth, fingers tracing the single word etched there with trembling reverence. Lena. Below it, almost worn away by time, were three faint words that struck him like a prayer whispered in the dark. My heart, my hope. He knew instinctively this was her grave. A secret marker placed by Clara Thorne herself, likely in the dead of night after Lena's quiet passing, a final act of love and defiance hidden from her own father's cold gaze. The dark red rose pressed inside the clock had almost certainly been taken from this very spot, its petals preserved like drops of dried blood from a wound that had never healed. Arthur carefully lifted the stone's edge, breathing in the rich, loamy scent of the bayou soil mixed with decaying leaves and wild jasmine. He returned to the grand hall of Belle Rêve carrying this new, sacred fragment. In the library, he laid it gently beside the journal, the tarnished silver locket, and the fragile pressed rose. For relics now rested on the scarred oak table, no longer separate objects, but pieces of a single, heartbreaking testament. The grandfather clock stood silent across the room, its hands still frozen at 3:17. Its face no longer mocked him. It had become something far more solemn, a tombstone, a memorial, a defiant cry frozen in mahogany and brass. The psychological weight began to crush Arthur in the weeks that followed. He woke in the dead of night, sheets soaked with sweat despite the humming ceiling fan, haunted by visions he could not escape. He saw Lena young, graceful, intelligent, having her newborn ripped from her arms before dawn. He saw Elias Thorne's icy eyes as he counted $300 for his own flesh and blood. He heard Clara's frantic pleas falling on deaf ears. The oppressive Louisiana summer heat only amplified the torment, wrapping the old mansion in a thick, suffocating blanket that felt like the breath of every unconfessed sin still lingering in its walls. Arthur no longer saw himself as a simple heir restoring a decaying plantation. He had become the unwilling custodian of a terrible truth, a truth that demanded to be witnessed. He brought the grave marker to Era one humid evening. She sat on her porch, rocking slowly, her eyes reflecting the bruised purple and fiery orange of the setting sun. Crickets and frogs sang their indifferent symphony from the bayou. When Arthur showed her the stone, Era nodded slowly, sorrow carving deeper lines into her weathered face. "Clara did what she could," she said quietly. "She couldn't save them in life, but she could remember them in death. That marker was her penance, and her promise." Arthur's voice cracked. "What about the child? Did anyone ever try to find him? Did Lena ever have any real hope?" Era let out a deep, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry 70 years of swallowed grief. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Arthur, especially when it's all you have left." Lena clung to it like a drowning woman to driftwood, even as it slowly choked the life from her. After the war, when freedom rang across the South, a few of the freed men tried to help. They sent word downriver. They asked in the Delta plantations. But a child sold that young, he vanished like smoke in the wind. No trace. No name. Nothing. The finality of her words hung heavy in the thick evening air. Yet the deepest wound was still to come. As the sun dipped below the cypress trees, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, Era leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt almost sacred. "There's one more thing, Arthur. A part of Lena's story that Clara could never bring herself to write fully in that journal. A darkness only those who lived through it could truly know." Arthur's heart pounded. He sensed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle approaching. After the boy was taken, Era continued, her words barely louder than the evening breeze, Lena was never the same. She moved through Belle Rêve like a ghost. But Elias Thorne wasn't finished with her. He saw her brokenness not as reason for mercy, but as opportunity for deeper control. A cold dread crawled up Arthur's spine like ice water. "What do you mean?" "He kept her close," Era said, her voice gaining quiet, terrible intensity. "Made her his personal maid. His shadow. Day after day, year after year, she was forced to serve him in this very house, to stand in the same rooms where her child had been born and stolen. He made her watch him eat at the long table. Made her polish the silver he used to count the money from the sale. He would speak of the boy, not directly to her, but loud enough for her to hear. He'd brag about the good price he received. How the boy would grow into a fine field hand someday. He wanted her to suffer. He wanted to break what little remained of her spirit completely." Arthur gasped, the sound catching painfully in his throat. The image was unbearable, Lena, eyes hollow, forced to serve the man who had violated her, fathered her child, then sold that child away, all while reminding her daily of his absolute power. It was a cruelty worse than any whip, Era said, reverence and rage woven into her tone. A slow, deliberate torture of the soul. Psychological chains stronger than iron. Clara hinted at Elias's coldness in her journal, but she shielded the full horror, perhaps even from herself. Era's eyes glistened in the fading light. Lena endured it for years without breaking in front of him. She never cried where he could see. She simply existed. Until one quiet morning she lay down in her bed and did not wake up. Her spirit had finally given out. She died of a broken heart, Arthur, as surely as if he had put a bullet through it. The silence that followed was absolute. Broken only by the distant hoot of an owl deep in the bayou. Arthur now understood the clock with devastating clarity. It was never merely a hiding place. It was a monument to Lena's silent, prolonged suffering. A testament to the depths of one man's depravity and the quiet strength of the women who refused to let that evil erase an entire life. The journal, the locket with Lena's serene face, the pressed rose, the hidden grave marker, all preserved against the tide of oblivion and lies. Clara witnessed it all, Era continued softly. It broke her in its own way. She couldn't stop her father while he lived, but she could defy him after death. Sealing that clock was her final act of rebellion against her father's evil, against the silence of the South, against a system that allowed such horrors to flourish unchecked. She made sure the truth would wait 70 years, long enough for the guilty to pass, long enough for a new generation to have the courage to face it. The full weight of the past crashed over Arthur like a tidal wave. The clock had not simply guarded a secret. It had guarded an unvarnished scream against casual brutality, a brutality woven into the very foundations of Belle Rêve. The something hidden inside was not just paper and metal. It was the agonizing truth of a life stolen, a soul methodically crushed, and a legacy of pain that had echoed through bloodlines until this very moment. As full darkness settled over the plantation, the oil lamp on Era's porch cast flickering shadows across her face. Arthur sat in stunned silence, the relics laid out before them like holy artifacts. "What will you do now, Arthur?" Era asked gently, her strong hand reaching out to rest on his arm. Her touch carried comfort and challenge at once. He stared at the journal, the locket, the rose, and the small stone marker. "I don't know yet," he admitted, voice raw. "But this changes everything. Belle Rêve isn't just an old house anymore. It's a monument to a crime. A testament to a life deliberately destroyed, and to the women who fought to keep her memory alive." In the months that followed, Arthur abandoned any dream of restoring the plantation to its former false glory. Instead, he became its truthkeeper. He meticulously preserved Clara's brittle pages. He had the locket and rose professionally cleaned and sealed in a protective case. He sat with Era for hours, writing down every memory she could bear to share. He documented Lena's story in careful, unflinching detail, not as a footnote in Southern history, but as the central tragedy it truly was. The Grand Hall, with its now open clock standing sentinel, became a somber memorial rather than a room to be restored. The peeling wallpaper, sagging verandas, and overgrown gardens were left largely untouched, their decay no longer neglect, but a visible reflection of the brokenness that had always lived here. Arthur never found Lena's lost son. The 70-year-old trail remained cold, swallowed by the vast indifference of history. But in telling Lena's story, in bringing her name, her suffering, and her quiet dignity into the light, he felt a profound sense of closure. A quiet victory against the forces of forgetting. The name Lena, once whispered in fear and sorrow, would now be spoken with reverence. And the grandfather clock in the main hall of Belle Rêve remained silent, its hands forever frozen at 3:17. But its silence was no longer empty. It had become a profound act of memory. A sentinel no longer guarding a secret, but proclaiming a truth that had waited 70 years to demand its rightful place in the light. A testament to the enduring power of one woman's broken heart, another woman's defiant pen, and a granddaughter's long silence finally broken so that justice, even if only through remembrance, could finally begin. The beautiful dream was gone. What remained was something far more honest, far more sacred. A reckoning. And in the humid Louisiana wind that moved through the live oaks and Spanish moss, if you listened closely on certain quiet nights, you could almost hear the faint, haunting echo of a spiritual rising once more from the old quarters, a song of sorrow, survival, and unbreakable hope that no amount of cruelty or time could ever fully silence.